It's a step from look what drug can do for me when I feel depressed. That drug should also have a restorative effect, or it will unbalance healthy functions of the brain and body. The drug then imparts only relative relief from misery and suspends the illness of withdrawal. If drugs offered a safe form of pleasure, there might be few objections to using them. Hello students, I'm Anil, Assistant Professor of English, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. In this session, we are going to look at an essay titled Dangers of Drug Abuse for the students of BCA second semester. Let us know something about the author. Hardin B. Jones. In short, he is Hardin B. Jones. He was an American professor of medical physics and physiology at the University of California. He was chairman of the graduate group of biophysics, medical physics, and bioradiology from 1956 to 62, and then again from 64 to 68. He also held a joint appointment as assistant director of donor laboratory from 1948 to 76, and from 59 to 60 as associate director of the Institute of Human Development. To summarize the entire essay, the essay Dangers of Drug Abuse, it deals with the hazards of menace that affects humankind because of the misuse of drugs. This essay is a warning against overuse and abuse of drugs. This is the gist of the entire essay, the dangers of drug abuse. Let us get into the essay. In the past 30 years, drugs have been discovered that prevent and cure physical disease and reverse the disturbances that occur in some mental illness. These drugs have been discovered that prevent physical disease and mental illness. Excitement over what drugs can do has led people to believe that any ailment, infective or psychic, can be relieved by taking a pill. Recently, people have believed that every pain has some solution through pills. At the sign of nervousness, they try pep pills. Medical journals now advertise tranquilizers, amphetamines, and the other mood-altering drugs. Doctors prescribe them, and the public expects miracles from them. In such an atmosphere, it is not surprising that drug abuse has spread. So whenever there is this mental ailment, the psychologists prefer some drugs. They reverse the situation and keep people happy. Now people are over into it, which has spread and it has become drug abuse in a large scale. When people become dependent on drugs to solve their problems, they lose the capacity to deal with life situation through perseverance, self-discipline, and mental effort. So this is the first danger of drug abuse. When they become dependent on drugs to solve the problems, they lose their capacity to deal with life situation with perseverance, self-discipline, and mental effort. It is now often considered naive to expend energy on solving a problem when there is an easy way out. So recently, people have started to believe that if there is a simple way to solve a situation, then why take the hard route? And it's a step from look what drug can do for me when I feel depressed, to imagine what drug can do for me when I feel good already. So now people are not only just using drugs when they are in pain, but they want to try it even when they are healthy. The distinction must be made, however, between medicine and the sensual drugs. We must not disdain the real and important advances science had made. So we should not be careful and go in a wrong route when science has advanced so far. The history of medical use of drug goes back 23 centuries to Hippocrates, the Greek physician who is regarded as the father of medicine. He was the first to recognize that a remedy must take into account not only the symptoms of the disease, but also the constitution and habits of the patient. So here we come to know the basics of medicine. Hippocrates, one of the Greek physicians, is regarded as the father of the medicine. And he first understood that drug is specific individual. We have to understand the symptoms of the disease and also the constitution and habits of the patient. So we have to do the right matching of the medicine with the patient. That principle have come down to us as the dictum that medicine must specifically suit the disease and the patient. That is, when there is a disorder, only a drug which specifically mitigates that disorder should be used. That drug should also have a restorative effect, or it will unbalance healthy functions of the brain and body. So if the drug did not match the standards to deal with the disease, then there is imbalance in the body and mind. The correlative of this principle is that a healthy person cannot benefit from taking a drug. So we have to understand this concept. When we are healthy, we need not use any drug. This too comes from the hypocrites who said person in good health quickly lose their strength by taking purgative medicines. So you have to understand this concept. If a person who is in good health consumes purgative medicines, drugs, his or her natural ability to cope up with the situation comes down. They'll quickly lose their strength. The distinction between medicines and sensual drug is simple. Sensual drugs are those that the body has no need for, but that give the user a strong sense of pleasure. What is the difference between medicines and sensual drugs? Medicines that help fight a disease, but sensual drugs that creates a sense of pleasure even if the body does not need it. Sensual drugs activate the brain's pleasure centers. We do not know precisely how they do this, whether they stimulate the pleasure centers directly or activate them through a chemical mimicry. In this essay, author will refer to both possibilities as simulations. In this particular essay, The Dangers of Drug Abuse, the author has tried to understand how they affect us. The brain governs sensations, moods, thoughts, and actions not by a magical process, but by an incredibly complex series of chemically regulated controls. These are easily upset by sensual drugs. The problem is this: the brain controls everything of a body. And when you use sensual drug, that will easily upset the work of a brain. This disturbance is apparent in the effect of the central drugs on the mechanisms that control pleasure and satisfaction. A drug user's craving for the drug is continuous, but he feels less and less satisfaction. The problem is this: when one starts using the drugs, the amount of pleasure that he or she is going through, they think that that is not sufficient for them. In severe addiction, his brain's pleasure reflexes seem to be weakened by artificial stimulation. That is the problem. In severe addiction, the pleasure mechanism fails to respond to drug stimulations. The drug then imparts only relative relief from misery and suspends the illness of withdrawal. When somebody goes on using these drugs, what happens? That person no more feels pleasure, but the state of his mind turns towards misery, and that person will show the symptoms of withdrawal. Illness of withdrawal. There is no interest to do anything, and that person becomes alone, aloof, etc. Information from the senses still reaches the brain, but now the brain is unable to evaluate the information and interpret it as pleasurable. In contrast, naturally attained pleasures enlarge the sense of satisfaction and can be repeated indefinitely. So when we stimulate the brain artificially, the brain loses its capacity to identify those pleasure things naturally. Then what happens? It loses its capacity and therefore reuse of drugs. But when you have the same kind of pleasure through natural process, the satisfaction improves. But when you start it with a drug, the satisfaction comes down. Ultimately, the sensory deprivation of the drug addict manifests itself in a general feeling of physical discomfort and in personality changes. So ultimately, the use of drugs could be identified or seen through the physical and psychological change. The addict feels depressed and fails to respond either to his environment or to other people. His mental disturbance can be quite similar to paranoia. So finally, this is how a person changes from a healthy individual to an unhealthy person. He cannot discern the source of his problem and looks for the cause in everything external but himself. Anything is suspect, he draws further and further into himself. So finally, what happens? The person will not understand that the problem is within himself. He starts finding problem with everything that is outside him. And finally, he suspects everything. There is this problem of further withdrawing away from himself. The addict often feels people are looking at him strangely. One told me he wasn't sure when people smile at him that they were not really laughing. So they start seeing things which are actually not there. The person who is drug addict and loses his senses, he becomes so afraid of people that whenever he or she looks at people, the person feels that as if everybody is looking at them in a strange manner. The addict can even lose his sense of being alive. Sometimes they feel that they are not alive. He feels dead inside. One rehabilitated heroin addict described his sensory deprivation to me looking out of the window. He said, "The sun is shining, the flowers are in bloom. I know these are signs of a good day, but pressing his chest, I don't feel it in here." A drug addict who was in a rehabilitation center, he explained how he was feeling. He could notice everything, but he could not feel anything in his mind or heart. So that is the problem. They disconnect from the present. I have seen addicts habitually press their fingers deep into their arms or legs as if to reassure themselves of their own reality. This craving for lost sensation explains in part addicts need to continue to seek drug-induced sensation. So when a drug addict becomes so much addicted to drugs, they lose the sense of present. They want to feel that they are still alive. They keep pressing their hands or legs in order to realize that they are still alive. And in order to understand or feel the same thing, they get in even more into drugs. It is like a snowball effect. Once a person gets addicted to drug, it requires more and more and more and more to keep themselves in a satisfied state, and that state never comes. The brain is the least understood part of the body. Research has been limited because of the brain's size and complexity, and because of the hazards involved in examining it, especially while it is functioning. So why have we not understood the brain so far, even when we have achieved so much in technology? The problem is the brain is so complex and we cannot understand or study brain opening it while it is functioning. We can only understand the brain when it is dead. We don't understand the process when it's alive. That is the major concern and major problem which hinders the growth or hinders the knowledge we have about brains. Though we know very little about functions contained in the brain, such as the ability to reason and think abstractly, we know more about functions that correspond to activities of the body, such as seeing and sexual activities. These are more easily researched and explained. So we cannot understand the brain, working of the brain, but we can only understand how the brain is controlling other activities of the body. So therefore, we don't know much about brain. If drugs offered a same form of pleasure, there might be few objections to using them. However, the claims that they are safe must be recognized as false in the face of the known consequences of the continuous drug use. If drugs offered a safe form of pleasure, there might be few objections to using them. If drugs gave us pleasure, if it was good for us, there would be limited objections for it. But what we have witnessed so far, we know that drug abuse has given us wrong consequences or bad consequences when it is used continuously. The real dangers exist, although the drug user often assumes they do not because the harmful side effects are not immediately apparent. So what is the real danger in abusing drugs? The little by little, people start consuming drugs and the effect is not seen immediately. That is the problem. When it becomes a big problem, it appears. Possible results range from incidental delirious effects to death from overdose. The dangers that lie between the extremes are the degeneration of health and the depletion of the brain function. The ultimate danger is this. The results range from incidental delirious effect. Sometimes when a person feels delirious, hysterical, then we come to know that the effect has gone far beyond control. And from overdose, people die. The dangers that lie between the extremes are degeneration of health and the depletion of the brain function. the health deteriorates slowly and also the brain cells die. The capacity of the brain is reduced. Drugs, after all, act directly on the brain and cause mental mechanism to respond abnormally. Those drugs, they directly affect the brain. They don't do physical harm to our legs, but they directly affect on the brain. And that will cause a mental mechanism to respond abnormally. The risks are great for the persistent user. In particular, there is a danger that will do himself a great deal of harm before the warning symptoms occur. Before we get to know that a person has used too much of drugs, it would have already destroyed most of the health. Drug-related health disorders are many and varied. Dirty needles and solutions used for injecting drugs can cause obsessions in the arm and veins, liver disease, venereal disease, and infection of kidneys and brain. Drug-related health issues. So here, the author says, when the person is into drugs, they start consuming it in different ways. And there is no healthy way of getting those things. Getting drugs into the body itself is wrong, and they are going through very wrong process, which will destroy all other parts of the body. Sniffing cocaine and amphetamines can damage the tissues of the nose, and marijuana and tobacco smoking can cause lung disease. So already these drugs start destroying brain, and along with them, sniffing cocaine and amphetamine can damage nose tissues, and marijuana and tobacco smoking, they cause lung diseases. So one by one, we destroy our body systematically without knowing. Heavy users of alcohol, volatile solvents, amphetamines, or marijuana may find that their livers are permanently damaged. If a person is using alcohol, heavy alcohol, volatile solvents, amphetamines, or marijuana, they will find that their livers are permanently damaged. Babies of women addicted to opiates are likely to be born addicted and to suffer from withdrawal symptoms. So not only one generation suffers from these drugs, but the individuals born out of a woman who is already into drugs will also have the effect. Cocaine and amphetamines can cause hair to fall. Hair fall is also caused by overuse of these drugs. Recent research has indicated that marijuana can damage cells. A drug user's way of life makes him susceptible to pneumonia, tuberculosis, and malnutrition and weight loss. Finally, an overdose of any of the essential drugs can lead to respiratory or cardiac failure, and finally, death. When these drugs are used in uncontrolled manner, then finally it will take us towards death. This article particularly focuses on the effects of drugs on the brain. This is not to minimize their effects or other parts of the body, for these can sometimes be more debilitating. Damage to the brain, however, is the most subtle, often unrecognized, and least understood consequences of drug abuse. When somebody is abusing drugs or injecting too much of drugs into their body, we cannot understand how they have acted on the brain, because we have the complexity of the brain where it stops us from understanding it. So finally, what happens? The brain is the main thing that gets destroyed in the body. Sensual drugs affect the chemistry of the brain cells. Cell function is carried out by thousands of enzymes acting within each cell. Depending on how the cell chemistry adds up, the cell either reinforces or shifts the dominance of cell pathways and hookups. Exposure of the cell to psychoactive drugs alters their chemistry. So there is a chemistry how each cell interacts with the other cell in the brain. When one starts consuming these sensual drugs, they alter their mechanism. Most studies agree that cells can recover from exposure to a low dose, but in certain instances, high doses or chronic use have been toxic. Toxic effects may be transitory or permanent depending on the cell damage. The amount of cell damage will decide that if the situation can be reversed or it is completely failed. The brain is composed mainly of brain nerve cells, neurons, blood vessels, supportive cells, that is glia, and insulating fat. The estimated 10 billion nerve cells from the substance of the brain through which thinking and feeling are carried on and by which brain messages are sent and received. This is how the brain is. It is composed mainly of nerve cells, neurons, glia, blood vessels, and insulating fat. It has around 10 billion nerve cells in the brain through which we think, we feel everything, and do day-to-day activity. Each nerve cell has 3 parts. You might have seen something like this. When you are in school, you could have saw this picture where you find brain cell. So each nerve cell has 3 parts, a cell body, one finger-like fiber axon, and many spreading extensions of the cell body dendrites that carry or inhibit the nerve impulse to and from other nerve cells. So these kinds of nerve cells are in good number, and that will make us feel everything. The dendrites of each brain nerve cell branch out to make about 5,000 connections with other brain nerve cells. Some are thought to make as many as 50 million such synaptic junctions between cells. So these neurons are interconnected. Each cell will make a minimum of 5,000 connections with other things, and sometimes it goes beyond 50 million. Messages are carried across or inhibited at these junctions by electrochemical controls. This is how we have understood brain's function. Thus, nerve cells communicate through waves of chemical changes sent along nerve pathways. Toxic chemicals through drugs can easily upset the delicate chemical balance of the brain's intricate system of communication. They may also damage cell tissue. So, these drugs which we inject into the body from external ways may damage all these structure. These are the effect of drugs. A person who starts using it to increase the pleasure, with time he is unable to identify the satisfaction. And due to feel the satisfaction, the person consumes more and more drugs, which would damage his brain, and finally the brain would fail to recognize the pleasure and there is no satisfaction. It is like a vicious cycle which brings in more drugs into the body and body degenerates, and finally the person will have withdrawal symptoms from the society, delirious situations in his mind, and finally it may cause death. Youth should know that drugs are just to make body recover from an illness when body does not cope up. But that is not the situation always. We have to bring our body and mind into a healthy situation with perseverance, mental strength, etc. So here, drug abuse is not the solution. It is one of the greatest problems for body and mind. With this, we shall meet in the next class. Thank you.